Welcome to the seventh and final Maryland in the Age of Sail lecture series with our lecturer, curator of maritime history at Calvert Marine Museum, Mark Wilkins. I am Jeff Murray, the director here at Calvert Marine Museum. I'd like to welcome all of you. At the end of this, I'll talk a little bit. Hopefully, we'll be announcing another lecture series in the near future that will be a fall lecture series that might hopefully be in person. Post-COVID lecture series, which would be nice to get back to. I will assure you that, something we've learned through the COVID experience is that folks here, there, and everywhere around the world like to be able to have the opportunity to see these lectures after the fact. Once they are completed. And so, those who cannot attend in person at Calvert Marine Museum then will have the opportunity to watch. We will continue videotape these and make them available on our website. I do not have any sort of theme or I don't know what the fall lecture series will be, but we will be doing one either fall or winter here. Tonight's topic, Mark, got it again. We were talking about this morning. I said he'll have it by tonight. I can't remember.
Chesapeake Watercraft.
Chesapeake Watercraft. And with that, I'll let Mark take it away, and hopefully we're in good shape. Thank you all for joining. Thanks, Mark.
You bet. Thank you all for attending the last lecture. It's a little sad, I know. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I certainly appreciate everybody who's tuned in and supported this series. I also would like to extend to you, if you have ideas about lectures you would like to hear from the Maritime History Department, please let me know and let all of us know. We'd certainly entertain those notions if there's particular subjects that you find interesting. All right. Tonight's lecture is a little technical, but it goes over some of the unique aspects of Chesapeake Bay watercraft, which I really love because there's an honesty about the Chesapeake boats that you don't really, every boat has kind of a yacht and kind of a workboat iteration. And so Chesapeake has more workboats because it's definitely, the boats designs were driven by the fishing industry, the fishery, largely oyster and crabbing. So when we'll get into that. So let me stop blithering on here and share screen and see if I can find the talk. Let's see. I think I need, Jeff, can you allow me to share? I don't know if I can share. Let's try it again.
Hang on, you should be able to share. It says multiple participants can share.
Let's see.
Keep trying.
Okay. Let's see. Share screen. Whiteboard, screen, iPhone, launch meeting. What's this? No. What's wrong here? Hang on a sec. Let me get this.
Like I say, you should be able to share at this point. You have to pick the right screen from the options.
Let me do this. Let me open up the talk. There we go. There's that. Let me go back to.
You might be able to do it that way. That's what works for me.
What's that?
If you open it up and then go back through the process.
Okay. There it is. I got it. Okay. All right, folks. Let me minimize this.
There you go.
Slideshow. From beginning, bada bing, bada bang. Okay, we're ready to go. Development of Chesapeake Bay watercraft and fishing. A very sort of bland title, but hopefully the subject matter will be a little bit more interesting. Now, you've been inundated with the log canoes in past lectures, the native log canoes, and you're going to get it one more time with this because it's so important with regards to sort of European development of log type boats. So as you know, or may not know, the Chesapeake log canoe basically evolved from Native American dugout canoes. Earliest record was by, I think, Thomas Harriot in 1588. And basically, just a review for you, large diameter trees were usually felled, packing moss and mud at the base to fell, and then lighting a fire, which would basically automatically form a taper and it would also fell the tree. And then this DeBry engraving on the right, very well-known image, shows them scraping and burning the interior of the log, which was a very efficient process, if not a little bit labor-intensive. It also forced the sap in these large pitch pine logs to the surface of the log, thus sealing it like a varnish, which was a very nice sort of unwitting effect that they didn't know how they did it, they just did it. It's kind of cool. So anyway, some reached epic proportions, 40 to 50 feet long, but most were around 20, 22 feet. And this is largely dictated by the diameter of the log, right? You had these old growth timber stands that some of these trees were 3-4 feet in diameter back in the day, and they made great boats. They progressed as those were harvested and they got into the smaller boats, they ran into problems, basically smaller boats and the need for a new solution. So this is one of the earliest 17th century boats in existence, the Valentine canoe, circa 1650. She was 15 feet long, 25-inch beam, 18-inch deep. So she had a square or blunt stern and it had a pointed bow with some overhang. By overhang, I mean that angle raking forward right here, which makes a natural cutwater for surf, all right? And these were used for fishing, for transiting up and down the bay, the various creeks and estuaries, whatnot, and very efficient boats, very, I won't say easy to build, but very efficient use of material, and certainly fit very neatly within the ideology practiced by the native peoples, which is that they sort of embraced natural forms rather than like harvesting materials like the Europeans did, sawing it into lumber and then building a big boat. They kind of went with the existing forms, and in this case, a tree. All right, so in terms of boat building, Virginia versus Maryland.
Hi, Nan. Yeah, this is Ellie. I thought Alan might be interested in the Calvert Marine Museum.
You might, okay, very good. Little mute problem there. So the Virginia company was poorly equipped and didn't have many boat building tools or people that were knowledgeable in the same. So they depended largely on log canoes that they either purchased or built, copied from the native peoples. Now, Maryland colonists came equipped with tools and instructions from Lord Baltimore stating that necessaries for a boat for 3 or 4 tons, spikes, nails, pitch, tar, oakum, canvas for sails, ropes, anchor, iron, and that's sort of a corruption of rudder there, Rother. So they basically said, we're not doing what the Virginia company did because they really are restricted by that. We're going to bring materials and equipment, tools to build shallops and larger boats, okay? Yeah, Maryland initially relied on shallops or chaloops. It's another sort of morphing from the French word to shallops till about 1670. And most canoes, again, were built by native peoples. There are some examples of Europeans copying them, however. Our own boatwright, George Sturgeon, who just recently retired, one of the first boats he built here was a European version of the native log canoe, and it's in our small craft shed. You can see it, and it's got some interesting European additions to the basic log canoe that the native peoples built. It has some washboards, a small foredeck. It looks very European because it's very symmetrical, very rectilinear, and it's very designed as opposed to the sort of organic nature of the native log boats. So, as I mentioned, as these large logs became scarcer and scarcer due to over harvesting, building houses, burning, heating homes, etc., by 1688, the practice of using more than one log began, and this is really important. As I may have said, what's really cool about Maryland, amongst other things, is the fact that rather than disregard or disenfranchise native people's boat building methodology, they embraced it. They said, this is really cool. I like these log boats. Let's slap a couple logs together and make a bigger boat and do the same thing. Let's hollow it out. And this is kind of what they did. And it grew from, 2 log to 3 log to 4 to 5 to all the way up to 9 in the bugeyes of the 19th century. We'll get to that in a bit. But anyway, this is a very key thing that they did. So by 1705, both bow and stern were sharp with overhang. Sharp meaning pointy. It was basically a double ender. It could go either way, although there was sort of a modest nod to a transom or a stern back here. and this is definitely the bow. It's a little bit sharper up forward, okay? Use of single logs in parallel continued through the War of 1812. It's a very efficient boat, easy to build, simple to build. You didn't have a lot of money, you didn't have a lot of equipment. Maybe you had, an adze or an axe, and you could basically make one of these things. It was a good boat. I mean, and often, as we talked about in the tobacco trade, these log canoes were lashed together with a few planks, and then the hogsheads of tobacco were then thrown on top and sort of transited down creeks and whatnot to the larger ports. So it remained kind of an effective boat until through the War of 1812, which speaks volumes about how well these boats sort of did. I mean, Howard Chappell, the late curator emeritus of the Smithsonian for watercraft, basically said the measure of any boat's success is how well it's suited for the waters for which it was designed. So log boats are great for protected waters like the Chesapeake Bay or coastal inlets and small bays. And they're not a great sea boat, as you can tell, because they'd be easily swamped as any canoe or small boat with a small amount of freeboard would. But anyway, for the bay, they were great boats. So punts, sort of a morphing of the log canoe, small canoe about 12 to 15 feet. They were sharp-ended, somewhat unstable. Again, they were restricted by the size of the log. They were basically widened by means of steaming and splitting down the middle and sort of extending the beam a little bit. It was a poor solution for what was to become the multi-log boat. Description of one of these is recorded as early as 1736. They were used for hunting, fishing, and as tenders for larger vessels. Very shallow draft, very low freeboard type of vessel. Again, good for tobacco, transiting tobacco, poling down small creeks. Again, these punts were often lashed together to make a larger type of barge, okay, for transiting goods. So in talking about the canoe building centers, the multi-log canoes, that is, or the multi-log hulls, three basic building centers in the bay, one in Virginia, the Pocasson canoes, and in Maryland there were two, the Pocomoke and the Tilghman Island canoes. And there's the basic regions where these were developed, and they evolved in somewhat different fashions, okay? So this is an example of a Pocasson two-log canoe. As the name implies, it's basically two logs. You take two logs side by side, you dress or sort of plane off one side of each log with a broad axe so that you have a good mating surface. And then it's drawn together by means of either iron rod or trunnels, tree nails, and then shaped as you would a regular log canoe. Now it's a little bit larger, and you can see there's some interesting new additions. You've got washboards on the deck. There's a small little deck and a combing to keep spray out, so moderately more seaworthy. There's a centerboard in this one, the sailing one. There's the centerboard and a small sailing rig. So one of the first early examples of a sailing two-log canoe. And this is the Pocasson version, all right? So you really can't talk about any of this stuff without talking a little bit about the tools. For log canoes, for European log canoes, that is, the gouging adzes or the adzes with ears on them were indispensable for hollowing out the logs. This is a broad axe. These are various gouges here, a slick, which is a large chisel, draw knives and spoke shaves, various planes, and saws. And caulking tools down here, that gets a little bit later. And augers. These augers were used to bore the holes for fasteners. Large iron drift bolts or tree nails, trunnels were used. And of course, measuring equipment, calipers, compass dividers, squares, etc. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Once you owned a set of these, you could build, my goodness, almost anything. So we make a jump from, we've skipped over some, we're just talking about the Pocasson canoes, the 5-log canoes. This is a wonderful illustration that shows basically the design and construction of these multi-log canoes. The first log, the center canoe, was called the keel log, not surprisingly. And then the garboard log, which is basically a nod to the garboard strake or garboard plank in plank on frame boats, were then fitted the wing log, which made the transition from the bottom or the dead rise portion of the boat to the top side, so that turned the corner, so to speak. And then these rising wood pieces were filler pieces that were then basically drifted or nailed and supported on top of that to give you the hull shape. So you had these, they really stuck with the logs for the bottom rather than cutting frames and spiling them. And importantly, half models or molds were not used. This was done sort of rack of eye, which means basically by eye, these were shaped and formed. So very much the skill was in the boat builder in terms of the final shape for these things, okay? All right, you can see up here is when we talk about dead rise boats, this one on top is flat bottom, and this angle 19.8 degrees, 26 degrees, 0.5. That's the amount of dead rise in the amount of a hull, okay? When we talk about dead rise boat, it's that sort of V bottom on the bottom there, all right? So shaping the hull, yeah, so I apologize, these photographs are old and black and white, so they're not very colorful. But logs were temporarily spiked together to allow shaping of the dead rise, that's that bottom part, with the hull on its side. And they were taken apart and the interior hogged out using an adze, okay? So basically the pieces were tacked together, shaped, taken apart, and then hollowed, okay? And as I mentioned, everything was done by eye. Mating surfaces are joined by kerfing as many times as necessary for a perfect fit. Now this meant you put the two pieces together, and wherever there was something that was sticking out that wasn't allowing it to seat absolutely dead flat, that would be kerfed out with a broad axe or a plane until it got a nice tight fit, because that's what you want. Otherwise, the boat will leak. All right. And this is another illustration of the various pieces. You can see these beautiful shapes taken apart and then reassembled. And of course, the question is what to do with the bow and stern, these sort of jagged shark's tooth at the either end. Well, what are we going to do with that? We've got these shaped. How are we going to finish the boat, right? So what they did is basically those feathered edges were cut back to square, because a feather edge does not make a very good plank seam for a boat, because it'll catch water. It'll ultimately start to crack and fray and come apart. So you square that off and fill it in with these filling pieces up here. You can see them that fill in the rest of that hull. And these pieces are spiked or trundled together to finish the boat. All right. So it's a very sculptural approach to boat building, as opposed to, say, New England, where you have framed planked boats or lap strake boats, right? The clinker built boats that we talked about in the ocean going sailing vessel talk. And this shows you even better kind of example, showing these bottom pieces are the logs, and these squares, rectangular pieces and strips are the filler pieces, right? So that kind of filled in. It's kind of an odd way to build a boat, I must confess. I'm used to the more traditional types of things, but this is how they did it, and they seem to have held up very, very well. We have many boats in our collection that are, my goodness, over a century old and are in still good shape, right? So after the hull was basically completed, centerboard box, which is this thing in the middle of the boat, the knees are fitted, small washboards and combing. There's your washboards, combing, rig installed, mast rake. You can see this focus on canoe to the lower right is a beautiful thing. It's a very graceful sheer, a beautifully upswept stem with a slight forward blending into a sprung bowsprit and that raked mast. Very beautiful, elegant looking boat. And as I said, very sculptural. The amount of skill it takes to make one of the things, when you think about this done by complete eye by the boat builder, sighting down every curve, making sure it's fair, making sure the hull looks right, all of that. And of course, performance, the underwater body, how that shape's going to affect speed and stability and carrying capacity. Now, what's great about these log boats, and we'll get to this a little bit more in a little bit more detail later, completely smooth on the bottom. So what does that mean? Who cares, right? What's easy on your feet, that doesn't really matter. What it's really designed for is when you're tonging for oysters, you can just dump those in the bottom of the boat and get it basically when you're ready to offload. Shoveling those out was so easy with a log boat, right? Because it wouldn't get hung up on framing, planking, other traditional types of boat building. Would have all of these frames and stringers going fore and aft. Be very difficult to get all those oysters out in between that. So a nice smooth bottom made oyster harvesting, tonging, etc., very efficient and very easy. All right. So the museum's own Carla Sue, this is a 3-log boat. And those of you that have visited the museum will be very familiar with this boat. She's a beautiful boat, really. All of the things that we just talked about are incorporated in the Carla Sue. She has a jib, a self-tending, club-footed jib, and a very beautiful workboat, okay? Yeah, built in 1905 at Pocasson, Virginia. Brought to the Solomons to be used for oyster tonging, originally sail power, then converted to a 5-horse engine. Nolan Webster named her. And I believe this is a picture of her on Back Creek or Mill Creek, one of the creeks near the museum. I believe that's what that references. And you can see in this upper middle pane, again, this wonderful midship section, the 3 logs dressed down so they fit tight, basically pushed together and hollowed out and then reassembled. And then the upper top sides were planks and knees, and then the deck was fitted to that. So a really good example of a 3-log boat, and it's in our collection, and you can go see it at any time. If you go to the stern portside quarter, you can see there's a cutaway, and you can see those logs and the filler pieces. That's the reason that the museum did that, which you can see the construction methodology. And again, nice smooth bottom for oyster tonging, very efficient rig, basically self-tending jib. One man could sail this boat and tong for oysters at the same time, drop the sail. There's a single halyard for each jib and mainsail. So it made it very easy to navigate this boat around while you're oyster tonging. So, okay. And these are some details. I should have kind of scrolled through these a little bit more, but you see the rig here, the knees supporting the deck and the filler pieces that are tied into the logs. A very eclectic 4-deck arrangement here. This thwart that supports the mast, it's wedged into place. The bowsprit, which is sprung off center. I'm sorry, that's the tiller. That's the tiller. And then a very simple boom crutch to hold the boom when the sail is dropped. And you have, of course, oars on the bottom there so that this boat, importantly, can be rowed or sailed. If the wind dies, you could simply row her into port and offload your oysters, okay? So let's talk a little bit about Pocomoke and Tilghman. So these were, unlike the rack of eye or designed by the boat builder's sensibilities, the way you did this is you would first make a half model, and either waterline or logs were rendered. So basically, sometimes design by rack of eye is used, as with the Virginia craft, but they didn't use plans. They mainly use these half models. So these were for 5-log boats. So unlike the Pocasson canoe, the 5 logs are selected, squared, and stations. And what I mean by stations are these lines here. Each one of these stations, if you look at this drawing, these lines represent these curve sections in the body plan. That's the body plan above the profile plan, okay? So basically the stations are marked out on the logs, and then these curves are, it's cut to the curve at each station. Keel was molded first, then others followed with the final log fitting. After it was hollowed, they're attached together with bolts or butterfly plates. Now, butterfly plates, like the name implies, looks like a bow tie, basically, or a 2-ended dovetail. It prevents the planks from pulling apart, right? So it's a very, and it's wood on wood. It's a very simple system of joining these planks. And some of the boats in our small craft collection are joined just that way. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. So importantly, these were designed first in the half model, and then the model sections or the various shapes are transferred to the logs and then built that way. So it was a much more studied, considered approach to building these vessels than the Pocasson canoes, okay? So chine transition. Chine is the turn of the bilge, right? Scarf is cut into the end of the wing logs as if the waterline is cut through all logs. Side logs are fitted and planed off area, then frames and lap strakes to shear. Now, what does all that mean? So this is a little bit different from Pocasson canoes, these Pocomoke canoes. Basically, the logs were dressed, instead of like these ragged edges that were squared off and little filler pieces fit, it was cut to a uniform line. That's the chine transition right here, with these larger strakes fitting in all the way fore and aft. You can see it really clearly down here. So they all butt onto these large strakes. This was just a little bit of a different way of doing it. And this top strake here it's lapped over. You can see these knees, there's a notch in it. This top strake is lapped over the bottom part, okay? So it's a very somewhat different way of building a boat. Love the Ford in the background here showing you the time that this was photographed. So sailing rig, initially on the bay, rigs may have had 2 lateen rig sails. You remember that from way back, goes all the way back to the Mediterranean, right? By 1805, the leg of mutton sail had been employed and received a lot of popularity. This is like a mutton here. Some had booms like Daisy of 1891. Centerboard came into use 1850, 1860, spread to all boat types. Now, the advantage of a centerboard, obviously, is you can have a shallow draft boat that still can sail very well without a deep keel, okay? You drop the centerboard, it provides a plane of lateral resistance from which you can sail your boat. And when the waters got shallow, you could retract that centerboard and get into really shallow little creeks and whatnot to continue fishing. And this is all of these boats were designed for the fishery, right? We'll get in a little bit the Tilghman Island canoes, which are racing boats a little bit, but these are all work boats, okay? Tilghman canoes, there we go, got ahead of myself. The Tilghman Island canoes, these are beautiful boats. Rising planks are spiled and fitted carvel style. Okay, so what does that mean? We talked a little bit about carvel planking in some of the previous lectures. So this just means that rather than a big chunk that was hacked out, these were planks like lumber, flat planks that were spiled. In other words, the shape of the plank was taken from the boat as it grew by means of a spiling batten. You're probably lost. I apologize. It's pretty technical boat building stuff, but the planks to make it, let me see if I can make it sound really simple. So these top planks were basically, the shape was taken off the hull, transferred to a piece of lumber, like a 1x12 cut. And then when you bent it onto the boat, it would fit perfectly. Okay. Flat lumber, like 1 inch thick. When you bent it onto the boat, either steam it or bend it on cold, it would fit to the boat perfectly. That's what I mean by spiling, okay? Rather than a big piece of log that you sort of chunk on there and hack out to fit the rest of the boat, as with the Pocomoke and the Pocason canoes. So another characteristic feature of these boats was the clipper bow with the ornate trail boards. You can see it down here. You recognize those a little bit later on the skipjacks. The Maryland Oyster Law of 1872 required oyster tying canoes to have a license and number painted on the side. So this is the first nod to basically over harvesting, okay? You'll remember we talked about, I believe we talked about in one of the last lectures, the oyster trade from the 1600s moving to the late 19th century really radically tapered off. And, you know, it's always this yin-yang between regulation to preserve and sustain a species versus having to make a living as a fisherman, which have this push-pull, and the balance is somewhere in the middle, and it's imperfect at best, and depending on what time period you're talking about, it was beset with strife. It still is, okay? All right. So from these Tilghman canoes, the racing canoes developed. 1840, organized races held at St. Michael's. Workboats converted to racing. This is done in the history of watercraft. You had a workboat that worked really well as a fishing boat, and then like the Blue Nose fishing schooners up in Nova Scotia, for example. Really good fishing boat, but there's also fast, because what's the advantage of a fast fishing boat? Let's see. Well, you can probably figure it out. Get to market quick. Whoever gets to market quickest sets the price for a catch, okay? So you catch your fish, you want to get into market quick, offload your catch and sell it, and then get back out there and fish. You didn't want a boat that was dragging along, taking forever to get to port, right? Especially if there's faster boats that you're competing with. So yeah, the workboats were converted to racing via reduced scantlings. That means proportions, right? They're built lighter so they go faster, and a large press of canvas, a crazy large press of canvas. And you'll be familiar with these boats. They were basically ballasted by means of planks outboard to windward, and people would basically sit on those to keep the boat balanced from going over. Chesapeake Yacht Club in 1885, interest waned by 1903. So there was a golden pocket of time when these boats were actively raced. The various, Centerboard Log Canoe Association, they race them today. There's been a revival of these boats, which is wonderful to see, but they remain a dangerous type of vessel. I believe a couple summers ago, There were a couple of fatalities on these boats. Somebody got trapped under one of them and drowned. So, I don't want to cast aspersions, but they're exciting. It's an exciting boat to see race because they go so darn fast, and they carry a huge press of canvas. So I'm glad there's been a renaissance of this type of racing vessel on the bay. So a little bit about the fishery. Yeah, Yankees on the Chesapeake. They just can't get rid of them. 1737 professional oyster fishery began in the Chesapeake. This was done via log canoes, tonging, which is, you can see these are oyster tongs here. It's basically like a large plier type action, right? You open up the handles, it opens the tongs on the bottom, and you basically plunk it down on an oyster bed, close it, and the oysters are trapped right in here. You pull them up, you dump them in your boat, and you repeat, okay? So the New England beds were exhausted by 1800. By 1808, New England skippers were bringing Chesapeake oysters up to New England, mid-Atlantic states. So, I spent 20 years on Cape Cod, and you talk about each town as their oyster that they're very proud of, like Chatham oysters, Wellfleet oysters, all this stuff, Barnstable oysters. But guess what? They all came from the Chesapeake, and they were used to seed those beds up north because they had already exhausted their beds. So Yankees on the Chesapeake. Also, Yankees were basically the first to introduce dredges, the dreaded dredges on the Chesapeake Bay, which is largely responsible for over harvesting. And this is a dredge on the left here. This is a deck-mounted windlass, and there's the dredge. Basically, it drags along, and for those of you not familiar with it, drags along an oyster bed and just catches a large quantity of oysters, and then you winch it up, dump it on deck, and repeat, okay? Yeah, dredges were too heavy for small log boats. This was the impetus for larger boats. The Yankee boats that came down were various types of schooners and sloops, larger boats that could carry these dredges. So got the people in the Chesapeake thinking, well, in order to harvest more oysters, we need bigger boats, basically. Beds were stripped. Maryland outlawed dredges in 1820. Oyster packing trade organized in 1836. So again, you have this ramp up of fishing. Oysters, people are bringing these larger catches. They're packed in oyster houses like our own Lower Oyster House, right? And sent via rail and ship or packet or schooner, all points in the world, really, continental United States and abroad. Once that we learned how to can properly and pack them, they were sent all over the place and were sought after, right? So just going to skip around a little bit about those sort of ramping you up for the development of the bugeye and the skipjack, but let me just talk a little bit about some of the other boats on the bay. Okay, so pungies were small, handy schooners, traditionally built, carvel plank on frame, between 30 and 80 feet, developed 1840 to 50s to 80s. These were replaced by the bugeyes, right? Because as I mentioned, these for fishing, these traditional boats weren't as good as the log bottom boats. They had a pronounced drag to the keel and dead rise, deeper draft, so they weren't so good for the shallower waters. They could stay middle of the bay or where there was deep water, but that's about it. They were largely used for transiting up and down the bay, goods from, say, Newport News and points south up to the head of the bay. Greatest beam forward of amidships, log rail instead of bulwarks. So what that means simply, bulwarks are a built-up sides of the boat. It's basically stanchions and planks. So these pungies had log bulwarks, basically log rails, instead of that. So that's something very definitely ascribed to the Chesapeake Bay as opposed to other points. And she had the rake masts. These would carry over from the Baltimore Clippers. Anyway, so that's kind of a pungie in a nutshell. We have, I believe, a pungie in our collection of models in the main Maritime gallery. The ram, it's kind of the super tanker or the semi of the day. Multi-masted, low-value load carriers that traveled up canals and up and down the bay. They were slow, ponderous load carriers. As I mentioned, like the super tankers and cargo ships of today, they just kind of went up and down the bay, transiting large, low-value, bulky goods like cotton, anthracite coal, ice, all kinds of stuff. So that's a ram. We have I think there's a model. Yeah, there's our model of a ram in our collection. That's in the Maritime Gallery in the back right near the War of 1812 thing. And there's not much to it. It's just a load carrier, right? semi-shallow draft, as as many masts as needed, and a fair amount of deck space and cargo hold space. So coasting canoes, yeah, log canoes too small to be cost effective, deliver catches to market. So again, we're sort of reiterating this use of the coasting canoes. Winters are rough in an open canoe, so this led to fitting of cuddy cabins and bunks and small decks so they could stay out in colder weather and rougher weather. Leg of mutton foresail and mainsail, no jib. Yeah, main was removable for shortening sail if they needed to. If it got really stormy, they could take the main down. Used until about mid-century, mid-19th century, although somewhere around to the 19th century. So again, this is just sort of a reiteration of the coastal canoes that were used, multi-log, of course, to deliver cargo and small amounts of cargo and fish various points in the bay, okay? So the Brogan's really the precursor to the bugeye, the famous bugeye. By 1840, demand for oysters was great. As I mentioned, these log bottom boats, and the Brogan was one, usually had 5 log bottom, were much easier to scrape those, scrape or shovel those oysters out of the hold than a plank on frame type of boat. Yeah, acrimony arose over the use of the dredge. It was stripping the beds. The feds thought, well, how are we going to sustain this fishery if the beds are being stripped? The fishermen loved it because they were making a good living, right? Getting a nice, healthy catch each time. But the long-term result was that the beds were being depleted. So the multi-log vessels grew in size, and sail rig became these Brogans, which is sort of the intermediary step between the small Pocason canoes, 2 or 3 logs like the Carla Sue, to the larger bugeyes like the 9-log bugeyes of the late 19th century. Okay, so because this is a picture of a Brogan in our permanent collection. See, it has a fairly low freeboard, 2-mast, leg of mutton rig, and centerboard. Okay, so it could get into shallower waters, and again, that all important log bottom. So the bugeye. So the oyster beds were sort of had a chance to recoup themselves during the American Civil War. With the blockade on the bay, the Union blockade, fishery was kind of mitigated. There wasn't as much action based on all of the naval engagements going on between the Confederate raiders and the Union blockade, blah, blah, blah. So this gave the oyster beds a chance to kind of recharge themselves, all right? So after the war, the Maryland legislature repealed the Act of 1820, allowing dredging on the whole bay, but under sail only, okay? So yeah, so this was kind of a way to regulate it. This led to the development of the bugeye. Yeah, punji sloop schooners used, but bulwarks were too high or too deep in draft, requiring several trained sailors. Wasn't as easy to harvest oysters with dredges on these high topsides boats with rails, because it's tough to get them over the rails, just inefficient. Ceilings of plank on frame vessels are damaged severely from oyster shells. Yeah, you've held an oyster shell in your hands, right? They're very sharp. They'd cut up the planking really, to pieces, chip it, splinter it, etc. Yeah, and another important point: these plank on frame vessels required basically skilled boat builders or shipwrights, whereas I debate this point. They claim any oysterman can handle an axe or an adze. That's not necessarily true. It took a lot of skill to build these boats on the one hand. On the other hand, there is some truth to that with a few tools, example, you didn't need to spiral planks like I just mentioned, the elaborate system of templating a compound curve so it could be transferred to flat stock and then fit perfectly on the boat with a caulking bevel. Didn't need that with log-built boats, all right? So yeah, there's some truth to some of that. But this led to the development of these larger bugeyes, right? Larger logs, 7 to 9 logs, could hold more oysters, right? So they began appearing late 1860s after the Civil War. First proper model, Coral of 1867, one of the first truly bugeyes attributable to the type. It was about 50 to 60 feet length on deck, 5 or more logs. Carvel plank frame topsides. So yeah, you had a log bottom with a carvel planked topside, meaning that the planks were spiled, okay, like we talked about. This was a very efficient system because it kept the weight down low, give you a shallow draft boat because these logs were very thick. I mean, you have to think about this. Most of these log bottoms had about 9 inches of wood near the keel, tapering out to about 4 inches to turn the bilge. So it gave you a heavy bottom. In effect, you didn't have to ballast the boat because it was all this wood, lighter topsides, which made it a good sailor, yet it was smooth on the bottom to harvest those oysters as we've been talking about. Sail plan was that of the Brogan that was co-opted. It was keel boat originally, then went to centerboard. Bugeye was a hybrid of canoes, pungy, bay schooner. So it's, again, this sort of coalescing of different types of boats. Had the sweeping sheer of the pungy, had the log, the logs of the log canoes, shoal draft, wide beam of the bay schooner. That's kind of it. There's a wonderful picture of bugeye sailing. I wish there were more bugeyes left on the bay. The St. Michael's, the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum has a beautifully restored Edna Lockwood, I believe. She visited the Maritime our museum a couple summers ago before COVID, and just a beautiful job of restoration. And of course, I think it's in here, our own William B. Tennyson. We can't really talk about bugeyes without talking about the Tennyson. I'm sure you all know. I love this boat as much as I do. It's one of a kind. It's on the historic register. It's the last of its kind, 9-log bugeye converted to boat. It was built in 1899 at Crab Island by Frank Laird. It was used to dredge oysters until around 1909, after which it was converted to powered boat by 1911. So what do I mean by powered boat? Well, you can see the bugeye rig. Let's just go over the features. Raked masts, right? Shallow draft, centerboard, as a cabin aft. It has a companionway forward, as a clipper bow, and a bowsprit. Okay, it's a slight taffrail here, which you can, and very low freeboard, so you could hoist the dredge over that very easily. Okay, usually there'd be batten boards on this midship section to make it even easier to get those dredges over the top of the boat. So boat, there's the lower left, that's the Tennyson as a bugeye, and there she is on the right, converted to boat, or her current iteration. So yeah, see how many modifications you can find. Well, for those shy ones, I will just go ahead and point them out. So you still basically had the clipper bow that was chopped down to more or less a very utilitarian stem. The masts were removed and a stump mast fitted a little bit farther aft than the original sailing mast. Pilot house added to the stern in place of the original aft cabin. And of course, power. A gasoline engine was fitted, and these loading booms and tackles were fitted to the boat. So what's the purpose of a boat? So here it is. Basically, the boats would go out to the fishing grounds and offload the catch from the fishermen and take it back to a market. They'd get a reduced price to do this. Since the fishermen didn't have to stop fishing, they could continue fishing, and basically the boat would get a good price on the catch, and they would take it in and sell it and then come back. Okay, so it's again, everything was driven by the fishery and making money. Okay, so and I must let me see if I have a picture of there's our own Tennyson and some other boats. We just had, I'll have you know, we just had the standing rigging and the mast repaired on the Tennyson over at Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. It's a lovely job. They did a really good job on the rigging. It's traditionally done with spliced eyes, parceled and served and tarred. It's just a beautiful, I love riggings. Really love this part of the boat. Next year, we're going to have a new mast made for our Tennyson and 2 booms. So we're going to have those rigging tackles, those offloading tackles, retrofitted to the Tennyson, which will make her more historically accurate. Okay, I'm trying to unpack some of the nod to the river cruise trade and kind of do a nice hybrid between historical authenticity and functionality. Okay, and here you can see in the lower left, this is a tour de force of of the Marine Museum's collection. There's Drum Point Lighthouse to the right. We'll call this the Dee of St. Mary's, and we'll call this the William B. Tennyson. Okay, it's kind of like in a nutshell. And this is the boat offloading the oysters from the skipjack and bringing them into the Little Oyster House, and that's up here. Exactly what it was designed to do. You bring the boat into the oyster house, unload, and they would be packed right there when they're nice and fresh, okay? So, as I mentioned, the logs, even the smaller logs, this is what led to the genesis of these multi-log boats. The log diameters are getting smaller and smaller and smaller till they finally got just too small. I mean, people were thinking, well, do we build an 11 log boat or we just go plank on frame? And that's kind of what happened. This led to the evolution of the skipjacks and the plank on frame by boat. And you can see this is basically here. It's traditionally built, still a dead rise boat. It's got the hard chine, this little pointy area here, the transition from the bottom of the boat to the side of the boat. But it's all done with lumber, okay? So no more logs. And again, this is a little bit problematic with regards to cargo. Usually these cargo boards would have to be replaced because they got chewed up by the oysters. And so that wasn't as efficient as a log bottom, but you know, when you don't have any logs, what are you gonna do? So plank on frame bugeyes were built during the as I mentioned, I got ahead of myself again, scarcity of log timbers. They had greater dead rise, easier bilges, gracefully curved topsides. So these were not hard chine. These were, you see the midship section, these were round bottom boats, bugeyes, and a little bit more graceful, a little bit deeper, greater beam to depth ratio, so they could, you know, they could hold a little bit more cargo. But again, they were problematic with the, you can see up here, the covering boards around the main hatch to protect the planking and framing from getting cut up by the oysters, okay? So this is basically making the transition from log. They still wanted the bugeyes, but they had to use lumber instead of logs for it. So, of course, I'm skipping around a bit, but this push-pull between regulatory authority and the fishermen led to the Oyster Wars. Okay, a little bit of a dramatic title. So by 1865, dredging under sail was allowed. 1868, the American commissioned Oyster Police Force, the Maryland Navy, so-called, consisting of a steamer, several fast sloops, and schooners, each of which was armed. You had these small little deck gun or swivel guns and muskets on board. This quotes Navy was not fully effective, but necessary. Patrolled the oyster beds, made sure that people were fishing when they should and not when they shouldn't. But of course, fishermen saw this very differently. They saw this as these guys were threatening our livelihood, my ability to feed my family, right? So they would fish at night. They would fish in the fog. They would do anything they could to avoid this silly little Navy. It was, I mean, it was a small amount of boats, couldn't nearly cover the amount of beds they needed to. So it was kind of comic on the one hand, led to some skirmishing on the water, some exchange of gunfire, and so the so-called Oyster Wars. And you can see basically there's people fishing in a blizzard, which is, I mean, when you have to feed your family, you got to get out there and do what you got to do, right? I mean, fishing then as it is now still remains, it's a rough life. It's a hard life. And even today with the regulations in place, fishermen are forced to fish when they can to get their catch and to feed their families. So, all right. Yeah, oyster beds today are managed by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Service, and you can see very codified some of the beds that are protected. Again, you have fishing grounds that are, you know, allowed to be fished, and then there's sanctuaries that basically regenerate the species and that are then opened up to fishing, and then other beds are closed down to let them rebuild. And it's a delicate balance. It's imperfect at best. Oyster fishing isn't today what it once was at all. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about skipjacks, right? The most iconic boat when you think of the Chesapeake Bay. What comes to mind more so than a skipjack? Probably nothing. So maybe super tankers. I don't know. So it evolved in the turn of the century from large bay crabbing skiffs, or bateaus, a French term. This is a dead rise boat, smaller boat. Again, anyone with a few tools could build from lumber. So moving away from logs, now lumber, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, made lumber very available and cheap. Ruby G. Ford was the first herringbone bottom plank skipjack of 1891. I'll get to that in a minute, what I mean by herringbone. It's basically the planking is at an angle to the keel moving aft. Named for any dead rise or V-bottom boat bigger than a skiff was a bateau. Yeah, so that's the predecessor to the skipjack. And here we go, skipjack construction. Here's that herringbone right here. You can see the planks move from perpendicular to the keel up forward and then rake aft, okay? So I'm not sure exactly the reason for that. I mean, there's maybe a little bit less water resistance on the planking seams for that herringbone pattern. Anyway, it's characteristic of the boat. You can see it's got a nice amount of keel, deadwood, centerboard. There's that clipper bow. This is a small one, okay? Chesapeake Bay Bateau or Skipjack. It's got a hard chine, this right here. Moderate dead rise and rugged boats, okay? Easy to build, basically designed so that a fisherman and his son or sons could whack this together in their backyard, shove it in the water and go fishing. So no round bottom hulls, minimal spiling in terms of fitting the planks, made from readily available lumber, okay? And here's some wonderful pictures showing sort of the deck arrangement. Here you have the donkey engine on the deck. This was used to hoist in the dredges. You can see the oysters piled on deck, just very haphazardly in piles. And again, the construction of this is the main mast, this is the centerboard trunk. These are some grown knees up forward. The knees are to basically prevent the mast from making the bow work too much, because that's where all that power punches down right there on the keel, and very, very heavily braced, okay? And then the aft cabin, a little bit more nicely finished. It's got tongue and groove, beaded staving, some windows. This is where captain would and the mate would have their meals, sleep, etc. Okay, and meant to be. I mean, you see three guys here, meant to be staffed by or manned by very few people, and that's important because paying crew goes into your take-home pay, right? So, although dredging could only occur under sail, skipjack could be pushed to the oyster beds by engine, okay? These push boats they carried, they basically pushed the skipjack out to the beds under motor, then the sail was raised, and then they could dredge, okay? So it's a pretty good workaround. Skipjacks carried their push boats on the sterns. Our own Dee of St. Mary has a pair of davits fitted for a push boat. We have the Dee's push boat in storage. Been a lot of debate about whether we want to bring that back. And basically there was a couple of points on the transom that the bow was padded, literally just push the skipjack along and back to port, okay? So it was a workaround around the regulations. So I have to talk about the Dee of St. Mary's, our own flagship skipjack, built in the 1970s by Jackie Russell, and came to the museum, I believe in the 80s. And just a wonderful boat. I got to know the Dee of St. Mary intimately over the past couple of weeks. We had to repair, she's Coast Guard certified for 40 passengers. We had to repair a large section of her inner timbers up in the forepeak. So the Guild and I spent a good amount of the last two weeks up forward fitting sister chines to her existing chines so that she could be refastened and made seaworthy and certified by the Coast Guard. So it was a wonderful time. But anyway, I would encourage all of you to take a ride on the Dee. She's cruising all summer, and I think her first cruise is tomorrow night. And anyway, so after the skipjacks, so a little bit about some of the smaller boats for use for crabbing. Little sisters of Bateau skipjacks are these crabbing skiffs, and they were built from 1880s to 1920s. Small boats, usually under 28 feet, some flat bottom, many dead rise, V bottom, right? Crabbers towed boat while waiting or stood in boat. So yeah, you basically pull the boat alongside you, pick crabs, throw them in the boat, okay? Or pull along till you find crabs, jump overboard, and catch your crabs that way. Very low tech way of crabbing. And there's one under sail, okay? It's a wonderful photograph because it's like a small skipjack here, dead rise motorboat here. It might be, I think it's a draketail. And then this small little crabbing boat here. Crabbing flatty. This is a bizarre rig. It has a very severely raked mast with a forward raked, I won't call it a jib, but it's doing the job the jib does. Okay, stick up headsail, yeah. Cross plank bottom, inexpensive, easy to build. And many such variations on a theme of these types of boats, right? Many skipjacks, again, a smaller, handy rig. It's got a self-tending jib, easy rig to handle. Small boat, herringbone plank bottom, fairly fast, slight dead rise. So for small creeks, yeah, 18 feet, a very small boat. Built in Cambridge about 1910. So many such boats in between, very large boats, very small boats, okay? Crabbing Bateau, this was built around Pocomoke in 1918. It's an auxiliary, so it had an engine fitted to it as well as a sailing rig. Hewn keelson, which means it was hacked out with an axe and an adze. Heavily built, no thwarts. Double strongbacks running from chine to chine. These are basically transverse timbers here that supported the side of the boat. And again, kept this whole center area clear for harvesting the catch crabs, okay? Last slide, we're right about at 6, so this is perfect timing. Is one of my favorite boats in our collection. This is the Hooper Island draketail, and built early 1900s for gas engines. They're very fast boats, very skinny boats. Yeah, the shape of that characteristic transom, sort of the reverse transom, reduced spray. Okay, so very sleek, elegant boats. We're actually our own draketail. This is being actually retrofitted with a new, oh my goodness, I think it's a diesel. The original gas engine was damaged and unsafe, so it was hauled out, and we're replacing it with a diesel now. It's a very safe engine, a very good running engine. So excited about that. She'll be back in operation hopefully by midsummer. And we're working on a plan to get more of the public out on this type of boat. This up on the upper left is the Guild, the Patuxent Small Craft Guild, restoring that draketail. I believe, my goodness, I think 1980s or 90s that was done. And there it is finished. It was a very proud moment for the Guild because they completely rebuilt that boat. This construction plan was drawn by George Surgeon. As I mentioned, he just retired after 40 years with the museum. Great guy, great boat builder. I'm going to miss him a lot. And he drew this plan of the draketail. It's a boat very near and dear to George's heart. So anyway, I hope I wasn't boring you too much with all that technical talk, but I think we're done. So let me stop share. And any questions about all this? Let me ask you this. Would anybody, oh, here we go. Okay, so where did the name Skipjack come from? That's a great question. So I did this in one of my previous talks. I believe this was written, the name was coined in Baltimore Harbor by a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. I think it was early 20th century. He said that the boats just skip right along. He basically coined the term skipjack. Okay. Before that, it was oyster bateau, dead rise boat, blah, blah, blah. But he coined the term skipjack and it's stuck. Okay. I can't summon the date precisely, but I believe it was early 20th century, 1911 or so, I think. Anyway, I'm glad I was able to answer that for you. So anybody else interested in building one of these boats?
Nope. Do we want to make reservations to get on these boats in the summer if we want to come down there?
That's a great question. I wish I had an answer for you. Now, the Dee and the Tennyson, of course, you can contact the main desk and sign up to go on a cruise for those boats, I believe, anytime. Melissa McCormick handles reservations for those. In terms of the other boats, like the boats you see in the basin, I believe you're allowed to take paddle boats and skiffs out on the weekends. There's a part-time person that we typically, is usually a college student that we hire to manage that project. By the way, if you're interested in any of these boats, our small craft shed on the boat basin has examples. I didn't even touch on some of them, like the Potomac Dory boats. That's more Virginia, but we've got a wonderful collection of dead rise boats and log boats. We have log boats going from 1 log all the way up to 9 log, at least partial fragments of the 9 log boats. So you can see that progression, and a lot of these construction techniques I mentioned, they're right there for you to see and experience. So by all means, check it out. That shed is underutilized in my opinion, and I wish that more people would take the time to go through there and look at some of these boats. Okay.
All right, if you have any interest in joining the guild, I would come down on a Tuesday or a Saturday to see what they do. Those are the days that they're over there in the guild building, and you can certainly do that without, purchasing admission to the museum. If you're sly about it, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll cure you of that shyness. The guys are all very friendly and welcoming. And we're also hoping, if you're interested even remotely in any of this, we're also hoping in the near future to be offering some boat building classes, so you can actually experience this firsthand, work on a boat, and see if you like it or not. So, yeah. If there's anything along those lines that you're interested in doing, do let us know. I'm stepping in for George right now as head of the guild, so just contact me, okay? Anyway, very good. Any other questions or comments? Well,
Just
thank
want
you.
to say thanks again.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed the series. Looking forward to the next one.
Okay, very good. We'll see what we can do.
All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us. This does wrap up the series. We do hope to have a fall or a winter series. We can get to that probably in person, but we will, of course, tape those lectures and make them available on our website. Thank you all for coming. Have an enjoyable evening, and stay dry here right now. So take care.
Okay, very good. Take care, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.